I would like to take some time to recognise the traditional custodians of the land on which I am privileged to be recording this vodcast today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to recognise their elders past, present and emerging. Hi, and welcome to The Growth Distillery. I've spent the bulk of my career building transformative insights capabilities that help organisations orient towards true customer centricity. I currently work leading News Corp Australia's Growth Intelligence Centre, where my team and I advise publishers, brands and industries across the country in the development of their growth strategies and narratives, through unapologetic customer-led thinking and data-based foresight. When I'm not chasing after my two young children, I spend the bulk of my professional life obsessing over consumer and cultural trends and representing the consumer when decisions are being made. In this series, we'll be delving into Australia's evolving customer and cultural dynamics. As marketers and advertisers, we're going to have to work harder than ever to retain our loyal customer bases in 2023. But on the other hand, I'm going to convince you that there may have never been a better time for you to grow and to create new value for your brands. In truth, it's all up for grabs for those willing to be brave. Which is why, in this first episode, I couldn't think of a better guest to join me than Jaimes Leggett. Jaimes is the founder of creative agency Today the Brave and former chief executive of M&C Saatchi. Jaimes is a fierce consumer and brand advocate, and he has an incredible wealth of experience in guiding brands through rapidly evolving and dynamic environments. I genuinely appreciate James's radically candid and research-led style, and his refreshing approach to sniffing out and calling out nonsense. As we kick off this series in 2023, Jaimes and I discuss what the combination of consumerism post-pandemic and an inflationary climate means for marketers. We explore the ecology of essentials and how Australians are choosing what they can and can't live without. And more importantly, how brands can make their products and services more valuable to more people right now. Because in truth, for some brands, there will be upside in the downturn. Jaimes, welcome to the Growth Distillery.
Dan, thank you for having me. This is great.
It's my pleasure. All right, so we are here to talk about bravery and I guess an alternative backdrop to 2023. I think we would all agree that we're moving into a year with a heightened level of uncertainty, not just off the back of the pandemic, and I think we're still all coming to terms with the very many lingering effects of what has been, a very tumultuous 3 years. But we've now got this added complexity of an inflationary climate and consumers really having to reassess what they can and can't live without. I'd love to get your perspective on what you see, in terms of the changes, in consumerism, but particularly as it relates to brand loyalty and the opportunities that there may be for marketers.
Wow, lots there. Big first question to start with, right? The pandemic was crazy, wasn't it? For so many reasons, but crazy for brands. Like what we thought was going to happen through the pandemic for brands and what actually happened for many is very different, right?
Yeah.
Some brands that came out of that pandemic better off.
Yeah, without a doubt.
They made more money, they made better margin. There are other brands that had a tough time of it. They had demand, but they didn't have supply. But those brands probably made a better margin, right? Obviously, there was some that flatlined and a lot went backwards, but it certainly was a negative for everyone.
Yeah.
So, when we think about the climate that we're coming into for 23, I sort of feel like we're going to see a similar thing happen. There will be brands that walk away from this next period of time better off, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
And there will be some that will undoubtedly have a hard time.
Yeah. And you talk about, brands that are going to come out, for simplicity, winners and losers. From your perspective, what do you see as that job to be done, to make sure that your brand falls on the right side of that fence?
Yeah, right. And I think this is interesting in context of the pandemic. I think what made brands win in the pandemic and what makes them win in this next period of time is very, very different, right? So let's talk about 2023.
Yep.
We are going into an environment where invariably people will have less disposable money.
Yep.
Right. And I think the opportunity for brands is to understand the role that they play in people's lives. Some of those products and services will be essential, right, to the needs of their audience. Some of those products and services might be nice to have little luxuries, affordable luxuries that make life better. Some of those things might be things that can be postponed and put off, and some of those things will be expendable and can be cut, right? So first off, I think brands need to understand the role that they play in people's lives. The second thing, I think they need to start thinking differently about their audience, right? Because yes, it's really important to understand who we're targeting and the environments that they're in and how they think and behave in those spaces. But I also think we need to start thinking about their attitudes to life and the situations that they are, which becomes a bit more nuanced. Because I imagine there are some customers within any target group, right, they've got to jam on the brakes, right? Life is tough, and for a whole bunch of reasons, they've got to jam on the brakes. There will be people within those segments who are feeling the pain, but have a bit of runway and are going to hold the course. Some that are well off and feel like life's pretty normal, and then others that will have a fairly laissez-faire approach to life and will be spending money anyway, right? And I think the opportunity for brands in there is to understand the role that they play in their lives, how many of each of those different groups sit within their segments, and start developing strategies for each of those subgroups within any particular market segment.
I love what you mentioned there. I think that there's two parts I'd love to maybe go a little deeper into. I think the first is, you mentioned there are going to be many flavors of impact. Right? I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all to how the next year is going to play out for consumers. I'm a firm believer that this year is an amazing opportunity for brands to introduce or reintroduce themselves to their customers. And, you made a great point of saying, really understanding the job to be done and the role that I play in my consumers' lives. How do brands go about exploring these new attitudinal dynamics, right? How do I go about understanding the role that I play and the dynamics of, value, particularly through those cohorts?
Look, I think it starts off, this is not rocket science, right? This is what I would hope that marketers have been doing.
Back to basics, absolutely.
Back to basics, for millennia. But really understanding who it is that we're talking to, who it is that we serve, why we serve, like what their barriers and drivers are, what the need that we serve is, understanding the product that we have, and more importantly, the parts of the product that are most relevant to the consumer and the need that we need to serve. And then finding a simple way of articulating that to them in a way that cuts through the clutter and the noise that exists in the world today. Yeah. It is simple. It's understanding the audience, understanding the most relevant parts of our business and our brand and our product that relates to that audience, and then finding a simple way to deliver a very clear message to them.
I love that. And one of the things that excites me most about the year to come really is that back to basics mentality. As you said, it's not rocket science. And I think that this combination of economic reappraisal at the same time that we've got what I would call almost a subjective well-being reappraisal off the back of the pandemic is going to force brands to really get back to proximity and closeness to their customers. You touched on a really important point that I think we're going to go much deeper into around essentials. But before we do that, I want to get your perspective on something, because there is a really hot topic, I think, with a real spectrum of beliefs around what's going on under the hood of customer loyalty at the moment. We saw in the pandemic an explosion of experimentation and trial, right? Be it through circumstances that we've elected, taking up new hobbies, wanting to sort of escape the everyday with new experiences, new products, new services, or for circumstances that we didn't elect to. So think, 2-year-long waits for cars, semiconductor shortages, the ever-present toilet paper shortage. How do you see, the evolving dynamics of consumer loyalty playing out this year?
Look, I think there's a couple of things in that, and I'm glad you asked the question, because I have a really firm view on this. Right?
Awesome, we like firm views.
I don't believe that consumers are any less loyal today than they have been in the past. I think their behavior would appear as such, but it's not fundamentally because they're less loyal, right? I think they've been forced into a position where they've needed to, for one reason or another, look at alternatives. In the old world, I used to do the thing that I did and buy the brands that I did because they were brands for people like me and they fitted into my life. We found ourselves in this evolving and transitionary environment where I either couldn't find the brand that I wanted, I couldn't get the particular product that I needed, or I couldn't afford it, right? And in that environment, consumers were forced to look out to the market again for the first time, not because they weren't loyal, but because they needed to, right? And in that world, some of those consumers found brands and found products that they liked better. Now, I don't believe that they would have got there otherwise, but because they were forced to look out into the world, they did. And in doing so, they found some things that were more interesting and, provided a greater sense of variety and whatever else.
I think that's a really insightful framing. It's not that, because I would agree, I don't think we as humans are any more or less loyal. In fact, you could argue that for brands that really hit the right note in terms of brand identity, if anything, we might be more loyal to them off the back of what has been a really, confronting period of time. It's more so that we have been either forced into the market or we've been, we've had a much greater opportunity to go and explore for alternatives or substitutes.
And this I think in here lies an opportunity for brands, right? Because
I agree.
If you are a brand now, or brands who have customers, the opportunity is to really double down on understanding that customer, the role you play in their lives, the needs that you serve, and make sure you deliver that in the best way you possibly can. And if you do, there's no need for them to go elsewhere, right? But there's also a hunting opportunity, right? Because in the world that is changing, you can assume that your competition, their customers, are going through change as well, right? And they may be looking out at the marketplace. So what you might find is there's an opportunity to accelerate growth by better serving the need of your competitors' customers as well.
Ooh, I like this. So I think we're narrowing in on what I would call a case for investment. So let's cover that off, I think, in a little bit more detail. From your perspective, how would you go about, for those that are watching and listening in, if I'm a marketer or an advertiser, how do I make a case for investment, when the default position from my CEO or from my CFO might be to pull back?
Look, I think, broadly speaking, that investment sits in a couple of different areas. Things that relate to brand and things that relate to sales. And I think the argument for each is slightly different, right? I think from a sales perspective, we talked earlier in the piece about better understanding the role that your product plays in consumers' lives and better understanding the attitudinal subsegments of your customer groups. If you find that your product is one that is deemed to be essential or a nice to have or must have luxury, then from a sales perspective, it's a simple story to tell, which is double down, spend as much as you can and accelerate growth. Because the world invariably there's going to be greater opportunity out there from a media perspective, from a share of voice perspective, right? Let's assume that as a total of the market, media spend might be down. In that environment, I imagine that brands will be able to get sharper deals on media. So spend the same money and get a disproportionate return on share of voice. Right? So from a sales perspective, I think there's a whole bunch of opportunity if you are targeting a group of people that need or want your product and can afford it, right? So
absolutely.
I think the sales story is fairly straightforward. I think what's also interesting is that of brand. And I think the brand story relates to every brand out there, not just those products that are deemed to be an opportunity for growth in the environment that we're going into, right? And I think that's about playing the long game because the recessionary period will end, right? And so where do you want to be? What side of the ledger do you want to be? Do you want to be the brands in your category that grew or those that didn't grow, right? And so this is an opportunity to kind of lay down, to remind your customers who you are or remind the market who you are and what you're about and what you believe and why you're a brand for people like them. And there's a stack of research out there, and everyone who's listening and watching this would have seen it and heard it. But the long and the short of it, the IPA study, which was by Liz Bonet and Peter Field, gets talked about a lot. But that's a great study. It's quantifiable data, and it talks to a loose rule of 60-40. 60% of your marketing budget being spent on brand activities, and 40% being spent on sales. And I think if you find a mix somewhere in there, you're delivering the short-term requirement while still building the long-term equity in your brand.
And I think that there's also, I think a growing body of evidence that brand building plays both the short and the long game. That very famous study from, the long and the short of it, there's now additional evidence to say that, investing in your brand can not only deliver you those long-term outputs and those long-term outcomes, but also has transcendent short-term benefits.
And just another point to add to that is, investing in brand doesn't mean producing communications or experiences or whatever it is that is purely and singularly brand-based.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
It's not zero sum. It's not one or the other.
No, of course you can deliver sales-based and promotion activity that reinforces and supports your brand platform.
So I want to change gear a bit, James. You mentioned essentials a number of times, and this is an area that I've been very lucky to explore quite deeply over the last few months. And I fundamentally agree with you. I think one of the critical jobs to be done as a brand is to make sure that you land on the right side of that decision, right? That you are a product or a service that is deemed to be essential. And in exploring this ecology, we found that there are cultural shifts. In particular, that we're all now in the business of being well, right? This idea of the micro moment, right? That trip to the restaurant to grab the best vanilla slice that you've ever had and the transcendent joy that you experience off the back of that. Our heightened awareness to shared experience, right? We are all incredibly social animals, and there are psychological phenomena that are making us more heightenedly aware to those circumstances. And escapism, right? We all want to escape the everyday, the rigors of the day in, day out. As a brand, if we are trying to understand and position our brands as essential, do you see these as mechanics that all brands or industries, regardless of sector, can try to leverage in terms of articulating the value to their customers?
I certainly think that they can articulate their value to customers, right? And the question is, can all brands service all of those needs or some of those needs? And I think this is where brands need to take a good look at themselves. In the world of a classic CVP, we have consumer insight and we have, brand insight the crossover of those interwoven veins will result in a territory for our CVP. Now, the reality is there's a whole bunch of things that the customer does and is interested in their universe of things. Right?
Their jobs to be done.
And there's a whole bunch of things that the brand does, right, that is really super interesting to the people that work in that business, right?
But maybe not to the consumer.
But not to the consumer, right? And actually the job we have as marketers is to find the points that intersect, right? And, it is literally as simple as that, is going back to basics, understanding the pieces of the puzzle that we can serve for the customer. What are the bits about our brand that solve those needs or fit those puzzle pieces?
I'd like to double click on something for a second. You mentioned that the fundamental objective right now for brands is to really succinctly and effectively communicate what you do for them, right, in the context of their changing backdrop. And you also mentioned that there are sort of these four archetypes in terms of the consumer narratives or the consumer segments that we're going to see this year. I'd love to get your take on, what is the job to be done then for those groups if you are an essential or a nice to have or a necessity, or a nice to and must have luxury, I think was the terminology that you used.
Yeah, and look, let me step back to step forward.
Sure.
In a world where the hypothesis is that many marketers who are going to be listening to this will be in an environment where they're being asked to cut spend on marketing. Right? What we're suggesting collectively is that it's not just a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You might be better placed to use a scalpel. So you might need to cut, you may have to cut, it might be a reality, but it's how and where and why you cut. In the context of that, I think it's important to understand the role your product plays in consumers' lives and the subset of each of your consumer groups. Because what you might find is that the majority of your particular customer base might be in the slam on the brakes mindset, right? And if looking at the role that your product plays in people's lives, in reality, if we're being true and authentic to it, we might say, well, actually, this is a product, the purchase that might be easily postponed. Well, the result of that might be simply that you've got to dial back your sales spend, because why flog sales on people who can't afford to buy that product now? It's going to be hugely inefficient, going to cost you a lot of money, and you'll lose your job. Right? Conversely, you might find that a lot of your customers are slamming the brake, of the mindset of slamming feet on the brakes, but equally you might find that your product is actually an essential. Right? If you're running the supermarkets, if I was a supermarket right now and I've got a lot of experience working on some of the supermarket brands, I'd be doubling down on my spend. Right? I might not be advertising the same product set that I was a year ago.
Yeah, the narrative might be different.
Exactly, but I would absolutely be doubling down my spending.
Yeah.
Equally, if we found that the majority of our subsets of our audiences were of the mindset where actually we're feeling fairly comfortable and well off right now, and if our product is seen to be a nice little luxury, well, then I'd be doubling down on that, because I tell you what, their lives are complicated. The environment is hard. There's a lot of bad news out there. They're going to need a little joy, right? And if our product offers a bit of a luxury, well, there's a great argument there to double down. And so what that isn't is aggressive marketing strategy. What that isn't is bravado. What that isn't is subjectivity. That's data-driven, informed marketing science. And I would argue that's bravery. So you're coming into an environment where the people in your business, your board, are telling you to cut costs, but we can quantify, we can show that the role that our product plays in people's lives is going to be more important in the future than it has been in the past. Then we should be spending more. We should be saying to the board, let's double our spend, not half it.
And I think you've got, I think that this gets further complicated by what we were discussing right at the beginning, which is there may be customers that are not your heartland audience that are in the market for reasons that they have elected or otherwise, that you may be able to have a conversation with that you might not even know. They may be hiding in plain sight. So if, to your point, if your heartland audience are slam on the brakes, but you've got those that are comfortably well off, but you know what, they're looking towards substitute products because the brand that they, have known and loved for many years either is now too expensive or it's no longer available, all of a sudden you have an opportunity to capture those audience, that consumer group or those audience members where you may not have been able to in years past.
I mean, how exciting to be working in marketing right now, right?
Absolutely
because
agree.
Wouldn't it be fantastic to be in a category where your competition was sleeping at the wheel, or where your competitive marketing teams are being hammered by their boards and told to cut spends? Because that there provides an absolute opportunity for us to double down our spend and to accelerate our growth in an environment that, a bigger slice of a smaller pie is still a bigger slice.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, there is a raft of empirical evidence that shows that these gains that you make in times of downturn have transcendent benefits when the economy does restart, and it bears fruit further and further downstream.
And the only thing I would add to that is that it needs to be quantified. It can't be marketing bravado. It has to be measured. It has to be deliberate. And it has to be substantiated.
All right. So to wrap this, I'd love to get the Jaimes Leggett synthesis of, from your perspective, what is the antidote to irrelevance for brands in our current climate? I'm an opportunist. I see, everything that you've mentioned, this idea of making your product or service essential, getting closer to your customers. I see this as a vehicle for almost any brand or category to make what they already do more valuable to more people right now. Am I too optimistic in my thinking?
No, I think there's a world of opportunity out there right now. I come into 23 and I feel good and excited for the brands that we work with and the market as a whole. But it is going to be difficult. Let's make no mistakes about that. But I think it's the brands that punch above their weight, that are smart, that have interesting stories to tell, that are engaging and inspiring and perhaps even disruptive. Those are the brands that are going to grow. And I would distill that down to a single word. I think the opportunity this year is to be brave. And brave is not bravado. Brave is measured, it's deliberate, it's considered, it's substantiated, and it's bold. And, if you can produce work that cuts through, that engages and excites the marketplace, where others look at you and go, crikey, that was a big call. But and within your business that it's been a deliberate and staged and managed process, then I think you're going to win.
So, James, I'd like to double click on bravery for a second, because I think you and I absolutely agree. Fortune will favour the brave in 2023. What does a brave brand look like?
I think a brave brand is a brand that's created work in market that's exciting and engaging and rewarding for the time that you spend with it. The sort of stuff that you look and go, God, that was great. That's amazing, right? But it's brands that have got to that work through a very step-through and managed process, which is, with foundations in data and insight and research, right? Brave is measured. Brave isn't bravado. So, we want to create work which excites and delights the audiences that we serve it to, but we don't want it to be random. We want it to be work which is measured.
I love that. Brave isn't bravado. That's a fabulous mantra. All right. I'd like to change gear a little bit as we sort of get to sort of the back end of this really, truly insightful chat. And I want to have a look through the looking glass. This is a part that I like to talk to each of the guests on the Growth Distillery about. And it's really your perspective on brand marketing in the year to come. Are we moving this year beyond the age of performance marketing? Is this really the renaissance of brand building?
Look, I don't think we're moving away from the age of performance marketing. Performance marketing is amazing. It drives growth in business. It drives sales. If your question, though, and I imagine the nuance in your question is slightly different, if the question is, are we moving away from the age of the dominance of performance marketing, I would say, I hope so, because we should be, right? We've talked a lot on this piece today about the importance of brand and connecting with people and growing brand. And I think what we need to see is more of that in the marketplace. I think it's worrying that split is dominated by sales-based and short-termism, whereas I think the real opportunity at the moment and over the next period of time is going to be in brand. So I think performance marketing is super important, and we need to be really focused on that and driving it because it works. But I don't think we should do that at the cost of brand, because brand is equally or arguably more important to your business over the long run. Think of it as, probably a poor analogy might be sugar and going to the gym, right? Sugar is amazing. You have it now, feel good immediately. Don't feel great in a little while, but I have more sugar and I feel good, right? The analogy of sales, right? Doesn't materially add to anything better. And actually maybe over time it attributes. I need more of it to feel better. Gym, conversely, feels a bit rubbish. You've done some press ups and feel sore and tired, whatever else. But if you maintain that gym activity over time, you feel better, right? And the more you do, the better you feel over time, and it's sustainable, right? And I think we should think of sales activity and brand activity the same. You need a bit of sugar every now and then to kind of prop you up, but we shouldn't do that at the cost of going to the gym.
I love that analogy, and it's one that I'm a huge advocate for, which is this pursuit of a balanced diet, right? Not just in marketing, but in what we consume and in our media. So then, my next question would then be, so what does a balanced diet look like? And if there isn't one answer, for those that are watching or listening, how might we go about seeking an optimum balance of diet, to that high GI, low GI dynamic that you were talking to?
Look, there's a stack of research out there, and we talked earlier about the IPA and the long and short of it.
Field and Binet.
Yeah, I love that study because it's quantifiable data based on 1,300 case studies over a period of 10 years. So it's robust data from the IPA Effectiveness Awards. And what that suggests is that the magic ratio is 60% brand, 40% performance-based or sales activity. Now, that's not going to be the same for every brand, and it's not going to be the same for every industry, right? But if your marketing spend is 90% sales and 10% brand, I would suggest that that's a problem. Equally, if it's 90% brand and 10% sales, you probably could be doing more. I don't think there's any one answer, but I do know that the answer is both, not one.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. All right. James, your 3 rules for sustainable growth for the coming year.
3 rules for the year, right? The first would be focus on the long term. Play the long term greed. The next year or 2 might be difficult, but recessionary periods finish, right? And I would ask you to ask yourself, what does your brand and what does your business look like when we come out of this period? And there will be brands that have grown within your category and brands that have shrunk. It's going to be the fastest, easiest way to grow your share of the pie over the next couple of years if you are that way inclined. The next I would suggest is defend your share of voice. We talked earlier about the opportunity to actually grow, maintain the status quo and grow, because if your spend doesn't increase, but media costs do soften, then you'll find you've got a greater share of voice by that alone. And then make the assumption that other brands in your category might reduce their spend, and you'll find that you're punching above your weight. So at worst, maintain the status quo, right? But if you find that you have to cut cost, because of, well, the reality of your business and the requirements of the board, then I would certainly not cut any further than your current share of voice. So, cut in relation to the market and your competition, but no further. And I guess the third thing that I would say is just, kind of seize the opportunity, because it is a lot of people are kind of talking us down over the next sort of year or two and telling us to bend down the hatches. And I just have a fundamentally different approach to that. I think this is going to be the most exciting time to be doing what we do. And let's just enjoy it. Let's hustle. Let's find those things and let's have a proper crack at it.
I love that. That is some sage wisdom. And then finally, I'd love to get your perspective on what this doesn't look like.
At its simplest, the worst thing that we could do as an industry and the worst thing that brands could do is flog things to people that they don't need who can't afford it, right? So if your product isn't serving a real need for that target group, back off, dial back the sales activation to that group of people and spend your money on brand and build for the long term. But you're not going to see the return. You're going to burn a lot of cash and you're going to create a whole bunch of inefficiency and, maybe even lose your job. If you flog a dead horse, you're selling something to people who can't afford it and don't need it.
I think that's wise, both through the lens of a business-to-business mentality, but also I think that there's a lot of altruism in terms of consumerism there.
Thank you.
James, thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to join us on The Growth Distillery.
That has been super fun, and I can't wait to not listen to this one. It's always weird hearing your own voice, but I can't wait to listen to the rest of them because I know who you've got lined up, and it's going to be fantastic.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.